I think on the day that I had snow in the South Island, I definitely had doubts as to whether I should even continue the tour because my sleeping gear, sleeping bag, sleeping pad is not made for winter weather. It's 3-season and I hadn't expected it to be that cold. And I put on all my clothes and was cycling, but my fingers were freezing and I could hardly feel the brakes. I had cycled for a week at that point once I restarted my tour and was thinking, do I need to ring the previous family I was ringing with to get them to pick me up? Should I just restart the tour from further on? What if the whole valley is covered in snow? It's really easy to have doubts when the weather is bad.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host Bella Malloy and I'm excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Viivi Rissanen. Originally from Finland, Viivi's passion for travel and the outdoors has led her to seek out adventure. It was in 2020, when facing a period of unemployment during the pandemic, that Viivi combined her love for exploration with that of riding bikes as well. Living in London at the time, she borrowed a friend's bike and started exploring new places in this mode of slow travel. What firstly started out as small individual rides soon turned into multi-day tours, then week-long trips, and before she knew it, Viivi started seeking out longer tours, crossing borders and then countries, with a trip from London to Posnan, Poland, a distance of almost 2,000 kilometres. In 2023, Viivi moved to New Zealand and set herself the new challenge of cycling the Tour Aotearoa, a trip that would encompass both the North and South Islands. Little did she know she would be setting off right when New Zealand would experience its wettest year on record. But it would take much more than some less than ideal weather conditions to put Viivi off this trip, and she recently finished this adventure, reaching the bottom of the South Island. I'm really looking forward to chatting with Viivi today and to listen to her experiences from these adventures, sharing insights from how travelling to different parts of the world on two wheels has been so enriching for her. Viivi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bella. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm excited to speak with you, Viivi, and to hear more about your adventures because I think you're going to have a fair few good ones to share with us. But Viivi, a question that I start my show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
So I don't remember anything to do with the color or the model, but it was a tricycle that had training wheels on. And I confirmed with my mother that I learned to ride a bike when I was 4 years old. So I was pretty into it early on. That was actually when we were living in Tanzania in quite a small rural village called Nkinga in the very west. So I, learned there. But the very first bike of my own that I rode, I do remember, one that I bought with my own money, was a spray-painted pink bicycle when I was 17 years old in Paris. They were on a language exchange. And I had absolutely no criteria for this bicycle besides that it needed to look pretty. So I didn't choose a very functioning model. If it had gears, it probably only had 3. And in the 1 month that I owned it, I managed to get punctures in both of the wheels. But I fancied myself quite a Parisian city cyclist, cycling around, the city centre to picnics and to my language class lessons. And it was a great way to get around the city and see it.
Just hearing those two different stories of bicycles featuring in your life from a young age and then picking it up again on a language exchange, there's some things that have already, I guess, tipped the way that the trajectory of this podcast is going to go, because clearly you have a passion for travel. You've also lived in a few countries. I mentioned in the intro you're from Finland, but you mentioned the story of growing up 4 years old in Tanzania, in France for a language exchange. I know you've also lived in London, and right now you're in New Zealand.
So New Zealand is actually the 10th country that I have been lucky enough to live in during my life. My parents moved the family abroad when we were quite young, so I left Finland when I was 2 years old. My dad was a pilot. He's now retired from that and working an office job, but not a commercial pilot like a lot of people think. You as an Australian will probably be very familiar with bush pilots operating in remote regions. So yeah, that's what he did, and that's why we would move every couple of years. So Tanzania was the first place that my family moved to. After then, we moved to Kenya, and we were there for a couple of years. So we do 3 to 4 years in one country before my parents got a new assignment. I also was lucky enough to live in Mongolia in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It's a great country for the outdoors, and it's probably where some of my love for the outdoors and kind of sense of adventure came from. There wasn't all that much to do. It wasn't super developed then. Things have changed quite a lot in the last 20 years with the arrival of more foreigners, more expats, more money. But it's got very few people and very wide open landscapes. So we would go horse riding, kayaking with my dad. As part of Girl Scouts, we would do orienteering. So lots and lots of outdoor pursuits, which, to be fair, my parents did also do quite a lot of in Africa when we were living there. So they'd take us camping, and both my parents set off and climbed Kilimanjaro together in Mount Kenya. So I think from an early age, there was probably this idea that, there's lots of cool adventures out there that you can do outdoors. And it's up to you to maybe go find them and get involved and do as much of them as you want. But I will say it probably took me maybe another 10, 20 years possibly until I was in my later 20s to really get back into cycling. Moving to London probably didn't help. It's a big city. I was told early on that it wasn't really a cyclable city, and actually probably because partly due to the countries that I lived in, they don't tend to have great cycle infrastructure. It wasn't necessarily super safe to be on the roads. Didn't actually do all that much cycling as a child, which is probably quite different to kids growing up in Finland. It's a very safe country for cycling. So yeah, cycling was something that I only really got into in about 2017 when I was in London. And when I say got into, I mean London has a city bike scheme very similar to Paris, where you can pay for rentals. And I would commute to work using that because London is also unfortunately notoriously known for high levels of bike theft. So I figured it was safer to use a city scheme bike that if it was stolen had nothing to do with me. And I was working an office job for a university. So I can't say that I was super well dressed for cycling. I was known to cycle to work wearing high-heeled boots and a dress, and would kind of have to hold the dress down with one hand to prevent it from blowing up while I had another hand on the handlebars, and handbag would sometimes fall out the basket in the front onto the road, and I'd have to scurry off and grab it back on. So it was very city commuter life back then. But actually, even those early days of cycling in London then inspired some shorter trips that then led on to bigger things. So I think anywhere that you can start from is great. It doesn't have to be the world's fanciest bike or, the world's longest journey for it to be kind of a spark for you.
Really what shines out there, though, Viivi, is that from a young age, this being in the outdoors and having mini outdoor adventures or holidays that encompass the outdoors and activities in the outdoors, it's sort of been embedded into the way you were raised. And I guess there's two ways that could have gone. You could have grown up as an adult absolutely hating it, or it could have been that you've rediscovered it and it's part of you, or maybe rediscover is not the right word. Maybe it's never left you. Something with my guests that I've noticed, there's some of my guests who absolutely just love riding bikes. They would ride a bike regardless of whether they're on a bike tour or not. And there's another type of guest that rides a bike to bike tour, so to travel in that manner, to undertake slow travel. Which one of those categories do you think you were from?
I think I'm probably very much in the second category. I have given other forms of cycling a go. So when I was in London, a friend persuaded me to try road cycling club, and I went along for a session with a borrowed bike from my housemate. At the time, I didn't have a bike with road handlebars, and I found it a little bit stressful. And yeah, I'm also very much not into this kind of high-end cycling gear, battling to shave milligrams off of my kit. And I appreciate that not every road cyclist is like that, but it was kind of the vibe in the club. So yeah, I was lucky enough that back when I rediscovered cycling during COVID and managed to borrow a bike off a friend, we also ended up doing some bike tours together. And I think the people that I ended up cycling with, kind of ad hoc friends from here and there, were very much into cycling for the same reasons as I was. We didn't necessarily have all that much experience, but we thought it was a good way to see things a little bit slower than you might in a car, to appreciate the scenery, and to probably also feel the physical effort a little bit more. It was never really about the time. For me, cycle touring, it just takes as long as it takes. And I think the longest distance that I've ever cycled on a bike is 140 kilometers in a day. So it's far, but it's not all that far when you start comparing, to ultra cycling distances, etc. And I'm still in awe of people that manage to cycle 200 plus K in a day because, yeah, I think my body just goes, I'd quite like to sleep now and just get off the bike. I have a couple of different rules on my tours that I follow for safety reasons and kind of personal well-being and things. And they probably look very different to somebody else's, but I find that's what keeps cycling enjoyable for me. So yeah, it's kind of cycling on my own terms rather than doing it for speed or doing it to beat any records.
The most important thing is whatever your motivations are for cycling, they've got to be ones that you enjoy. Can I ask just quickly, randomly, you lived in 10 countries. How many languages do you speak? Hello listeners, it's Bella here, host and producer of Seek Travel Ride. Many of you have recently gotten in touch with me to find out how you might be able to support the show. I am an independent podcaster, which pretty much means I sort of do everything. I research my guests, I interview them, I put their audio together and I do an edit of that, and then obviously I release the episodes and market them as well. It's been a great experience now for just over a year, and we have 60 episodes in the bag as well. But pretty much if you do want to support the show and show some love to the content that I have been producing, I have recently set up a Buy Me a Coffee account. It's just a way that you can financially contribute to the show and put some funds towards the running costs of producing this podcast. I'm very proud to be an independent podcaster, and whilst it does mean there's a lot of work on this show at my end, it's an absolute joy to bring it to you at your end. I have included a link in the show notes to my Buy Me a Coffee account there. So if you want to support the show, just click on that link. Once again, thank you all so much for your support. Now let's get back to the episode.
3 fluently and bits and pieces of others. So I am bilingual in English and Finnish. Both my parents were Finnish, and that's the language that we always spoke at home growing up. I do speak French because I studied French in school and then at university. So I did an Erasmus study abroad year in France, the opposite end of the country to where you are. I was in Strasbourg. Yeah, I was studying politics. So most of my lectures and things were in French. So I've never worked in French. But yeah, I speak bits and pieces of Japanese and Arabic and Hebrew. My family lived in the Middle East for a couple of years, and I was lucky enough to live in Japan for a year before I came to New Zealand. Traveling definitely gives you the chance to learn bits and pieces of new languages. And sometimes it's nice to eavesdrop on people's conversations, try and connect with locals, with travelers en route. Yeah, it can be fun to be a little spy sometimes in the midst of others.
Living in where you lived in Africa there in Tanzania and Kenya, did you learn any Swahili as well?
Yeah, a little bit. So Swahili is more predominantly spoken in Tanzania. It is an official language. In Kenya, they rely a lot more on tribal languages. I did go to an international school, and unfortunately, it wasn't a subject that was taught. It was French that was taught at my school. But yeah, kind of basic phrases, greetings, etc.
This is going to be really random. So I have a really good friend of mine who is from Finland, Viivi. We actually spoke about it a little bit before I pressed record, but she actually grew up in Kenya as well and also went into an international school. So I don't know how many of them there are there. It would be so random if for some reason both of you were at the same school.
I could well know her even if we didn't attend the same school, only because the Nordic community in most countries that I've lived in tends to be pretty tight-knit. So in Kenya, for example, there are Norwegian and Swedish schools separately that teach their curriculums, and there's not enough Finnish students for there to be our own school. But there was a small Finnish language program that was partly subsidized by the Finnish government abroad for kind of maintaining culture and language skills. And the embassy would organize things like Independence Day celebrations. And there was Nordic Sports Day every year, which 5 countries, sometimes with borrowed family members or friends from other countries that kind of had a very tenuous connection, would be borrowed to make up team numbers. We would play everything from kind of, volleyball to floorball, which is very Nordic. And my parents also took part in wife carrying, which is a traditional Finnish sport. I'm not sure if you're aware of it.
No. Is it what it sounds like?
It is. There are various techniques for best carrying your wife or woman. I'm sure in today's day and age, you can have whatever gendered couples you'd like. But the most effective one is often, you can find this on YouTube, is the person carrying has the one being carried. It's not a piggyback ride usually, is not the favorite technique. It's hanging off the other person's back with your legs in the air and kind of facing your head towards the ground.
I can picture it. Yeah. Sort of slumped over their shoulder sort of thing, like a sack of potatoes or something.
Kind of, yeah, with your legs looped around their shoulders. So you're hanging upside down, the one being carried. I'm not sure who invented the technique, but usually there's an obstacle course where you have to climb over things and sometimes you have to wade through some water. So apparently it's quite good because it means the person can hold themselves up out of the water somehow. I'm not sure. They're kind of continuously doing like an ab crunch. It's very funny to watch. I highly recommend. And the wife carrying world championships do actually take place in Finland as a serious event. So if anyone is interested, you can take part in that.
I'm so going to go down a YouTube rabbit hole of that as soon as we finish recording. I think it'll be quite entertaining for me as well, which will be pretty cool. Okay, so well-traveled and lots of languages under the belt, which I guess maybe also assists you in maybe being a little bit less nervous about exploring different countries and stuff as well, because if you understand a language, it makes things a lot easier. I love the idea that you've been exploring on your bicycle. I know we're going to get into the details of your Tour Aotearoa trip in New Zealand, but you also did quite a lot of hikes on that trip too. Did you hike previous to going to New Zealand? Was hiking something you really enjoyed?
It is definitely something I've enjoyed, but I think going back to the motivators that you mentioned, a lot of times when I went on walks in London or the surrounding areas when I was living there, my motivator would be finishing at a pub and having a pint at the end. And the types of hikes that I was able to do there, the terrain and scenery are quite different to the mountains and bush that you get in New Zealand. So it's definitely a lot more intense here.
Absolutely. And I guess I wouldn't say more survivalist, but you would have longer stretches without resupply in New Zealand too. Like there would be more technical terrain. Am I right?
Definitely. A lot of the cycle routes go along stretches where there is no internet. So, in Europe and in London, when I've been cycling, if, sometimes I couldn't remember how to do something that was easy enough to YouTube it. It's not really something that's available. The internet connection across New Zealand can be quite patchy and intermittent. So yeah, you're very much self-reliant and kind of doing any sort of outdoor pursuits here, whether it's hiking or cycling, often involves doing some research in advance of how many days you might be out, how much food you need, what the weather conditions will be like, and just making sure you're prepared more for safety reasons, because there are unfortunately quite a lot of search and rescue operations that are carried out every month, and not always of tourists, also of New Zealanders who might have bitten off a little more than they can chew and ended up in a bit of a sticky situation. So my goal cycling through here, but generally also when I take part in outdoor activities is to do it safely and to not end up in a helicopter or having to be rescued. So that informs a lot of the decisions that I make. And I think having outdoor experience definitely gives you an idea of your limits and how far you can push them. But sometimes you have to take a step back and think, this might not be the best route for me. And I definitely had some of those moments on this most recent tour of New Zealand where some stretches of the trail I left out because they were particularly muddy or I had a very loaded bike. The information that I found also suggested that it would be much, much easier with, a bike packing setup or kind of a credit card tour as it is. And yeah, I made those decisions in the interest of my own safety and so that I would have a better time rather than slogging through mud. So my tour might have looked a little bit different than what some others have cycled, but I think that is part of the beauty of every person's cycle tour is you never cycle the same route as someone else. Even if on paper it might look the same, you will get lost at various points. You will meet all kinds of amazing people and that will inform your whole experience.
Even if you're cycling with others, your experiences aren't exactly a mirror image of theirs. Like it might be point to point and lunch stops and stuff, but you're still observing things for yourself. You're still feeling a physical strain that might be different to what theirs is. You might be a stronger climber than them. They might be a better descender than you or stuff like that. So you're feeling things so much differently on a bike as well. Testament to New Zealand, it's such a beautiful, stunning, wild landscape of a country, really. Big, high peaks and stunning lakes and beautiful beaches and everything in between, volcanoes, hot springs and stuff like that. But I guess it also goes hand in hand with some sketchy terrain because the Tour Aotearoa, it's mainly off-road, isn't it?
Yeah, so it is, of the 3,000 kilometers that it runs through, it's a mix of sealed roads, gravel roads, some four-wheel drive tracks, official cycle trails. and it does aim to avoid high traffic main roads. They have explored every rideable track in the country, and they design both cycling and walking trails and work together with the government to manage construction of new trails, which is great for anyone who really loves being outdoors here because they're always working on new ideas. When I set out to cycle this route, arriving on New Zealand, it was kind of just a faint idea in the back of my mind, I guess, based on the fact that I had done a longer trip of Poland. But I didn't have a bike when I came to New Zealand. I had left the bike that I had finished my last European cycle tour on in Europe. So I was on the market for a new bike, and it was the first time I was ever buying a brand new bike to me. So I decided to go with a gravel bike, thinking that it could handle both off-road and on-road, knowing that I'm not that much of a road cyclist, but I'm also not a hardcore mountain biker. But yeah, I think some of the tracks involved in the Tour Aotearoa and just generally cycling through New Zealand, I really felt like I was underbiking some of the time, particularly given the fact that I had pannier racks. A lot of cyclists here choose to tour without them. They go with more of a bike packing setup, which gives them more flexibility. If I were to do it again, maybe I would pick a slightly different bike, a hardtail suspension. Front suspension mountain bike is pretty popular here for the purpose, but my bike survived with only a couple of minor mechanical things that needed fixing. So it's definitely doable on a gravel bike, but I would say there are some quite big differences touring in Europe versus in New Zealand. And in Europe, you will enjoy a lot more smoother tarmac roads designed for European road touring bikes that can have skinnier tires, and you'll still have a very comfortable ride.
When I first moved over to Europe from Australia, I had this expectation of doing many off-road gravel type tours, but what I was used to as Australian gravel is not European gravel. And certainly where I live, there's not really anything that's other than like an uphill goat track. There's small pockets, but it's certainly not navigable on a pure gravel bike like I have. And I don't have the mountain bike skills that would allow me to take on those trails. So it's interesting, like you said, how different our perspectives on what you can do with what bikes in different countries and the terrain, how much it changes. It's a bit like skiing and ski resorts. What one resort classifies as a green one might be a different resort's blue run, and vice versa. It's not quite uniform.
Yeah, I'm very much in awe of people that love really hard, chunky gravel roads, because those definitely exist in New Zealand. And I have had many a day where I've been riding gravel roads, especially with cars kind of going past and having dust in my face, thinking, when will the tarmac arrive again? But I have also come across cycle tours, not many at the time that I was cycling, because I was cycling in autumn, the start of winter, which most cyclists are actually cycling in summer here when the weather is meant to be nicer. But yeah, I have come across cyclists who've had far thinner tires, usually European cyclists who are expecting very silky smooth tarmac roads, and they've really struggled. So like you, I have massively appreciated having wider tires. And that is my recommendation for anybody coming cycle touring to New Zealand is invest in a wider tire. Make sure that your bike has the clearance to have. I think my tires were about 42 millimeters, but some people run up to 50 millimeter wide ones. Yeah, just for comfort.
You're not going to be regretting riding the widest tires your bike can take.
Exactly.
And you certainly don't want to be on 25 mil road bike tires by the sounds of things either.
No, that is what this he was actually a French cyclist over from Australia, and I met him on my first day in the South Island, and he had very skinny road tires with no tread on them, and he already had a puncture, and he had unfortunately lost his pump. So he'd managed to borrow one from somewhere, and he did make it work as far as I know. He was just aiming to get to the bottom of the South Island, so he managed it. But yeah, the bike he picked up secondhand in Wellington wasn't quite up to the job. So yeah, doing your research when going somewhere, I think, does really help. I am in awe of people that, cycle the world and have a bike that's fit for Europe and then fit for the Silk Road and the highways and, mountain roads of Tajikistan and wherever they end up. That's a whole different kettle of fish, I think, with those kind of roads. New Zealand roads aren't quite that bad, but I have had a lot of comments from people regarding drivers and driving. New Zealand isn't necessarily super cycle friendly. Some cities do have cycle paths and things. But yeah, like I mentioned, the Tour Aotearoa aims to avoid as many main busy roads as possible, but there is some inevitable cycling on state highways, which aren't motorways. Bikes are allowed on them. And sometimes there is a wider shoulder. And my experience, at least, is that trucks will do their best to give you room, provided you're visible. And one of the key rules that I had on the tour was not cycling in the dark, mainly for safety reasons. Kiwi drivers are not expecting cyclists on the road in many parts of the country during the day, let alone at night. So yeah, I would always stop cycling by sunset and make camp somewhere or stay indoors if that was my plan for the day and start again. Not necessarily at first light. I'm not a massive morning person, but always cycle during the day.
It's interesting when you mention the drivers there, because one of my previous guests, Pippa Langan, she left from London and cycled around the world, but the speedy style. I'm trying to think, did she even take 7 months to do it? And some days she was riding 300 kilometers and she slept in a bivvy and then changed to a hammock halfway. She was ultra light here, right? And her comment was that the most unsafe she felt was when she was riding in New Zealand, and she said she'd never recommend anyone ride on the roads in New Zealand. Everywhere else in the world was far safer for her. In Australia, the drivers were more angry and aggressive, but not as dangerous. But in New Zealand, it wasn't through malice. It was just, they're just not expecting to see you. So do you see where she's coming from with that comment then?
Possibly. I did have one of my best experiences on the trip that I had was probably as a result of someone only just seeing me in the nick of time, and it was a driver. I was on the North Island and cycling towards Wellington and had actually arranged to stay with a family through warm showers. I had looked up cycling directions. I was just using my phone. I didn't have maps. I don't have a Garmin computer, so it's just relying on internet. Thought I had downloaded the map offline. I hadn't. So during the course of my cycle towards my next destination, I accidentally clicked off and the route disappeared. I ended up missing a turn and cycled an hour further than I should have. When I realized and got back into network, I was still 2 hours away from where I was supposed to be. So I thought, well, there's nothing else for it. Unfortunately, wild camping isn't permitted in New Zealand. So I thought, okay, the only recourse I have is to keep cycling for the other 2 hours, and I will be heading into full darkness, but I have lights and things. There's not much I can do about it. And as I turned onto the next main road and started cycling, a ute slowly drove up next to me, and I had a farmer ask me where I was headed to and if I had somewhere to stay. And I explained my situation to him, and he said, well, I know you've got lights on and a high-vis vest, but I barely saw you coming around the corner, so I'm quite worried about you cycling all the way there. If you're happy to pitch your tent at mine, you can just come and stay in our garden. And I said, oh, that'd be great. And when I got to his neighbor actually offered me his cottage and said, oh, don't worry, she doesn't have to sleep outside. I've got a whole cabin in the back that we used to use for backpackers coming through, and it's got plenty of space. His neighbor was a forestry mechanic, and he said to me, make yourself at home. I'm actually going pig hunting tonight with my friends, but I'll leave my dog, and don't worry, I never lock the house. Help yourself to any wine in my fridge, and I'll see you in the morning and make you breakfast and coffee. And off he went. And I was really grateful for the opportunity to sleep indoors because it had been raining throughout that day. But yeah, that was my experience with, a driver, knowing that kind of New Zealand driving culture, people do drive fast. And for that reason, I think that's why I had that safety consideration of trying to avoid cycling in the dark wherever possible, knowing that people were expecting roads to be very empty. Because like Australia, in many places, it is quite an empty country. So people do drive very, very fast, especially late at night. And I think that's when most accidents happen. During the day, I may have had some close calls or incidents, but I've blocked them out. But similarly, in London, I cycled there for a number of years, have only positive stories to share. But when people heard there that I would be cycling or did regularly cycle to work, they'd always say, oh, I'm too terrified to ever get on a bike in London. But I think it also depends on your own level of risk you're willing to take. In London, cycling, I'm very conscious of, I don't squeeze in between buses and lorries. I'd rather miss a couple of traffic lights. And yeah, I take far fewer risks than I've seen some other cyclists take.
What you were saying there about London, I think it's come leaps and bounds to what it used to be 15, 20 years ago as well. And even I think since COVID times, has it gone the same way, I wonder, as a lot of other European cities where more and more people are riding as well?
I think so. When I was cycling to work just using the city bike scheme, and that was over 6 years ago, there were days when I would go to take a bike from the stand and they'd all be taken out. So I'd have to walk 5 minutes to the next one. So they were a popular method even back then, I think, for commuting. And definitely a lot of people did pick up, cycling and other outdoor things like running up during the pandemic, which I think is great for getting people active and outdoors.
A big reason why a lot of people commute as well is cost. In fact, one of my other guests who, again, from London, Ed Hawes, well, he cycled London to New Zealand, and he picked up cycling in London purely to save money. He wasn't earning a lot and he couldn't spend it on his commute. He couldn't afford the tubes. He got a bike on one of the commuter bikes tax schemes and started riding to work.
Yeah, I remember listening to his episode and it made me think back to when I was cycle commuting. The city bike scheme at the time, you could have a yearly pass for £100 and each ride was still restricted to 30 minutes. But that was instead of paying a couple of pounds a day. So I think it's a £2 fee otherwise to rent for the day. So provided you're going to be cycling, for more than 50 days of the year, it makes sense to get a yearly pass. And I thought, well, it's a no-brainer. It's way cheaper than buying my own bike as well and having to maintain it because the city authority maintains those bikes. So I can definitely see that in a big city like London, it makes sense. It really is cost saving. And I would cycle one way and sometimes get the bus or the tube back when I was using a rental bike. It's a great way to also see the city and it helped me navigate and, get less lost when I was on the bus and things. I knew much more about my own neighborhood. And that was actually the motivation behind some of the rides that I did during the pandemic, was actually rediscovering even just the areas of the city that I maybe hadn't seen so much of before and the borough that I was living in London during lockdown.
It's interesting. The last time I was in Paris, I used the city bike scheme there. It was funny, I was there to renew my Australian passport, but I remember riding to the embassy there, which is right near the Eiffel Tower, and then we were going to meet my husband's uncle and aunt over near Montmartre, and we looked at just getting the metro, and I said, let's just ride. And it was actually, the travel time was quicker to ride on the bikes than it was to take the metro, and I wonder if that's the same for a lot of people there as well. Cycling as a form of travel, there's one side of you which uses it to discover places. The other side, it's a practical way of getting from A to B as well, which is pretty cool. I definitely want to jump into more details of your New Zealand trip, but I don't want to skip over those early tours of yours either. I'd love to learn more about London to Posnan in Poland, to eat as many Polish pierogies as you could, as you gleefully called it. That trip was almost 2,000 kilometres there, Viivi. Did you envision it was going to be that big when you set off?
I had actually wanted to go on a longer trip when I set off on that one. So pre that trip, I had never cycled anything quite that long, but I had done some trips in the UK. Initially, I started off, with this borrowed bike from my friend. I was doing kind of 40, 60, 70 Ks just within London because it's such a big city. And that then led me to thinking, okay, well, maybe I could cycle to another city in the UK and get a train back. And that's what I did. So places like Brighton, Oxford, Cambridge were places that I managed to get to on my bike. The bike at the time was one that I bought off of eBay. It was an old 1994 suspensionless mountain bike. So not very fast riding, maybe about 13 kilometers an hour, got me from A to B. So yeah, on the basis of those shorter one-day trips, a friend suggested that we do a multi-day cycle in the south of England. So I'd been cycling for about 4 months. And my legs were getting pretty strong, so we were keen. And the South Downs route is a route between Brighton and London that can be walked, it can be cycled. So I had my mountain bike and the other two girls that I went with borrowed some. We maybe bit off a little bit more than we could chew. The terrain was quite rough. There was a lot of uphill, thousands of meters of elevation. We had to push our bikes. On the first day, we ran out of daylight because we were a bit late starting. Someone showed up late to the starting point in Winchester. So we actually caught a taxi. We were very much not camping. We were Airbnb-ing it. But we made it to the end and had a pub as a motivator. And I then was lucky enough to be able to do the coast-to-coast route or a version of it with my housemate at the time, who did have a bike and did cycle occasionally, but hadn't cycled toward. So that's a route in the north of England that runs from the west coast from around Whitehaven. There's a couple of different starting points through the Lake District and then Yorkshire and runs onto the east coast. Our finishing point on the east coast was very much dictated by cost, where would be the cheapest point to get a train back to London and what could we book our bikes onto. So that ended up being a 5-day tour. we deviated from the official route that there is for the coast to coast because we wanted to catch up with some university friends, which I think has always featured quite heavily in my tours. If there's something that I want to see on the way or people that I'd like to catch up with, I make that a focal point. And that was actually how I then designed that route between London and Poland. It was a very open-ended cycle tour initially when I started planning it, kind of in late 2021. At the time, I didn't have a tour appropriate bike. I still had this old suspension mountain bike and I could fit bikepacking bags on it, but it didn't have very many mounting points. And I just knew that, speed would be an issue. So I was lucky enough a few months later when I put out a call on some cycling groups, I had a friend get in touch and offer me her bike. She had actually gotten it thanks to her ex-boyfriend who was really into cycle touring, but they had since broken up. And she said, realistically, it's not something I'm going to do. So I'd be happy to pass on the bike to you. So I have benefited massively from friends, having spare bikes or having bikes they're happy to sell on. And I am really appreciative of that. I think cycling it's never a solo effort, even though you might be solo on a tour. There are always so many people helping you along the way in whatever capacity they can. So yeah, when I started thinking of this ride, had planned on leaving the UK longer term and had actually been thinking of maybe doing a ride around the world, having been inspired by many other cyclists' books that I had read. Everything from Anna McNuff that I have been lucky enough to read. Her adventures are amazing. She cycled all 50 states in the US soon after quitting her job, and she didn't have that much cycling experience, as well as Rebecca Lowe was a writer that I came across last year. She wrote a book called The Slow Road to Tehran, and she is a journalist first and very much was not a cyclist.
Rebecca's a previous guest of the show.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, I really love digging into her story there. And her book is very much that way too. I think she actually even starts it with saying, just a warning, this is not a book about cycling.
Yeah, and that's what I loved with these books. Anna McNuff, has since evolved into she's very much an adventurer, explorer, and kind of a similar journey of, discovery, being able to go further and faster and thinking maybe I could do more. But what I really loved about reading books, particularly by women who have gone on cycling adventures or, any kind of exploration, is this kind of starting point that they often describe themselves as very average, ordinary. And to me, their experiences made cycling longer distances seem possible. I did have doubts. It's very different to cycle a 3-day cycling route or 5 days compared to, and cycling for a month or longer.
Yeah.
But once I had the bike, I was able to start fleshing out some options. And I think I very much wanted to go some version of a route to Istanbul, go passing through Eastern Europe, which I hadn't had the chance before to go to Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. Unfortunately, in February 2022, once the Ukraine war broke out, that was no longer an option. So I was considering a version of the route that I ended up doing. So cycling through Poland and possibly continuing on to Finland and then figuring out some next steps from there, knowing that I wouldn't be able to enter Russia with the war still ongoing. And my route actually ended up being cut short quite a lot by the fact that, the opportunity to move to New Zealand came up. And I had a timeline on the visa that I was given. I needed to enter by September. And I thought, okay, well, I'm still working full time, but maybe if I quit my job a couple of months before I need to get to New Zealand and set off to go cycling, I could make this work. So that's what I ended up doing. And in plotting the route, I got in touch with old university friends that I knew lived in some of the countries along the way. So France and the Netherlands, Germany, and checked whether they were still there, whether they'd be around that summer, roughly the dates that I was passing through. And the people that I got yeses from ended up being the people that became plotting points on my route. So my route from London to Posnan wasn't necessarily the most logical one. It definitely wasn't the shortest one. But for me, it was a great way to discover countries that, with the exception of Poland, I had visited previously, but I had never been to many of the towns and the countryside. I think a lot of weekend trips that you do, and you'll know this from probably doing your own travels in Europe, you tend to get a flight to the capital and maybe explore that a little bit, but you might never see some of the smaller towns, just the countryside. And I had friends, particularly German friends, spent 2 weeks cycling through Germany on that trip. When I said I was cycling from Hamburg to Berlin, I had one German friend who was from near Frankfurt. She said to me, is there even anything between? those two cities. Like, I've never heard of anyone traveling there. Like, what could there be to see? And there's always something, I think. I'm very much not one of those people who thinks that, only certain things are worth seeing. I think anywhere that you cycle through, there are people and experiences to meet and hopefully some kind of views to see. And if it's not the most scenic, then there'll be something around the corner that will be. So for me, it was kind of a goodbye to Europe tour in that sense. I knew that I would soon be moving to New Zealand and I wanted to see more of Europe in a different way than I had seen until that date.
It's obviously a great segue into your New Zealand adventures, but something you said earlier there, I have to ask this question. You said you were potentially interested in the idea of cycling around the world. Do you think that could be in your future?
Pre-coming to New Zealand, yes, I would have been quite interested in it. I'm not sure what, route it would have taken. Actually, when I got the opportunity to come to New Zealand, my first thought was, oh, it's such a shame. The cutoff date is in 6 months' time. It would be great if it was next year. Then maybe I could cycle to New Zealand. There's a Finnish cyclist. His handle is Curious Pedals.
I've just seen his YouTube clip. Oh my gosh, the algorithm.
Yeah, and he's cycled from Helsinki to Singapore, and one of the duo has since come on to New Zealand, but that required a lot longer than what I had. And now that I'm in New Zealand, there are actually a couple of cycle routes here, bikepacking routes that are on my radar, either for this year or next, just with the caveat that I will need a different bike probably because they are bikepacking terrain, so it's rougher. So I'd need to invest in some kind of mountain bike. But there's a route here called the Tour Aotearoa, which runs across the North Island from Cape to Cape. You can cycle it both ways, either east to west or the other way, and it's just over 1,000 kilometers. It's quite remote. They advertise in the kind of route planning that there's only one cycle shop on that route, and it's New Plymouth, which is near Taranaki in the very southwest corner of the North Island. So you need to camp quite a lot of the way because there's very little accommodation that you have access to. They do run for most of the routes in New Zealand as well. If someone is not into solo cycling or traveling, they often run brevet events. So that's one option. And then there is a bikepacking route in the South Island called the Sound to Sound, which is a 1,500 kilometer route that runs from Queen Charlotte Sound in the very north down to Milford Sound, which is a little bit south of Queenstown. There's also an annual event for that if people want to do it in a group setting, and it takes 5 to 20 days. I don't know who could cycle that far in 5 days.
Thinking, did I hear the initial distance wrong? Because I was thinking, hang on, no, that's not possible in 5 days.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for the Tour Aotearoa, they also have a brevet that runs now. It's every year, and they have about 500 cyclists do it. And they only record finishes that last between 10 and 30 days. 30 days is the cutoff. But I have spoken to several people who know a guy who cycled the 3,000 kilometers in 8 days. But that finish time is not recorded because the organizers want to dissuade people from riding to exhaustion and riding in the dark, etc. So they have a minimum cutoff time of 10 days. But apparently some people can cycle it in less, just not me.
Everyone's motivation is different, right? But when I think of New Zealand, it's not a country I want to cycle fast through. I think physically it would be impossible in a lot of places to cycle fast through, but just the scenery is just absolutely spectacular. I've only been fortunate enough to go to the South Island, and I know the North Island scenery-wise is different really, but no less beautiful. Viivi, I'm just thinking of all the places that you would have been able to see, the top of the North Island down to the south of the South Island there. Listening to how you were planning your European tour, it was, a mishmash of who you were going to meet along the way. I know with the Tour Aotearoa, there was a route map there. And I also know that once you finished the North Island part of your trip, was it at the end of the North Island part of your trip that you took 4 months off because you were working in a ski resort?
Yeah, so I will caveat my experience of cycling through New Zealand with the fact that I only followed the tour map for the North Island portion of it. And that's because on the South Island, the official cycling route runs down the west coast. But I had secured a job offer at a ski field that was located near Christchurch, which is on the east side of the South Island. So I needed to make up a cycle route to get down the rest of the way. So yeah, when I was approaching this idea of cycling through New Zealand, I thought, okay, I could do it in stages. I have done cycling tours like that before. So when I spent some time in Cyprus working remotely during the pandemic, I was doing quite a lot of cycling, but it was never really necessarily joined up. I would cycle stretches along the coast, etc. And then at some point, I looked on a map and realized that I had cycled most of the coastline and thought, oh, well, I could just keep doing kind of this piecemeal bit and just try and see the entire coast. And that's what I ended up doing in the time that I was there. But I didn't set out to do that from the beginning. So I was very open to, having a flexible route. And I asked for suggestions on, the Facebook cycling group and things, and sometimes just had to go along the state highway. There wasn't that many cycle trails in the east. So I spent 6 weeks in total cycling from the very far north of New Zealand, Cape Reinga, down to Wellington, caught the ferry across, and then cycled down to a little bit past Christchurch to a small Canterbury town called Methven, which has the ski field of Mount Hutt near it. And that is where I took 4 months off and was working an office job in a ski field, got to ski, got to snowboard, had a great winter. The weather was definitely not cycling appropriate. So I, like I mentioned earlier, was cycling in autumn and the start of winter. And by the time I reached the South Island, I was still camping, but I very quickly then transitioned to, luckily there were more warm showers hosts to stay with around the Christchurch area because it was actually just too cold to sleep outside. It was getting to the point where my feet were cold every night and I was sleeping very, very poorly. Wouldn't recommend cycling through New Zealand and camping in May, June, July, August necessarily. September can also still be quite cold in the South Island. I didn't have any terribly bad weather in the South Island until I actually restarted my tour then 4 months later. And I had one day where I ended up camping in snow and woke up to it, which was really quite unexpected. It was some very late October snow.
How did your tent go with so much wet weather? I know that you said you transitioned to having to be in warm showers because of the cold and stuff, but what sort of tent did you actually have?
Oh, my tent is fabulous. I have no complaints. It's an OEX Fox, I think, version 2 tent that I bought in the UK. I will say it's not the most ultralight of tents. It weighs, for a 2-person tent, it's about just over 2 kilos, but it does fit me in all my cycle touring bags inside if I want them. When I was cycling, I always did lock my bike, but particularly in New Zealand, places are quite remote. So sometimes I would leave some of my bike packing bags on there for the night and lock the bike to a tree or a fence. So yeah, all my wet weather gear very much survived. That tent is still going. I was camping in it a few weeks ago and have just given it a waterproofing spray again. But yeah, there are definitely lighter tents out there that you could go for if you were looking to save weight. But I think I mentioned before, my panniers were very heavily loaded. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that I knew I was cycling into winter and so needed to have, lots of layers and fleece options. But I actually cycled most of that route wearing sandals. If it got cold, I'd just put some socks on under my sandals. Even if it was raining, they dried out pretty quickly.
Was the point of wearing sandals there because wearing closed shoes with the weather, they'd just be forever wet anyway?
I think so. And to be fair, I didn't have many days that were that cold cycling. Even if it was wet, it wasn't necessarily super cold and wet. So I got quite lucky in that sense. But once I reached the South Island, the rain stopped. The east coast of the South Island is quite dry, but the North Island was very, very wet. So I did camp in the rain, but I also interspersed my bike packing with stays in hostels, sometimes stays with warm showers families. Up in the very far north of New Zealand, in Northland, I stayed on a dairy farm with a warm showers couple who I learned quite a lot about dairy farming from. They'd had the cyclone of 2022 come through and power had gone out, and they were telling me the problems they'd faced with milking their cows. So I've definitely had the opportunity to learn so much more about life in rural New Zealand than I ever could have if I hadn't cycled through the country. And living in the South Island for what ended up being 4 months and then longer, continuing my cycle tour further south, exposed me to a lot of people that I wouldn't necessarily have met living in Auckland, which is where I was before until then. They're definitely not big city people down in the South Island, which you might have noticed as well when you were traveling New Zealand.
Definitely. I love that. But I'm not a big city person either. I mean, I look at where I've moved to, a small village in the Pyrenees. It's definitely not a big city environment. Our major traffic jam is when a farmer's moving a herd of cattle from the mountain down through the little streets. I was going to say then, Viivi, notwithstanding the fact like you set off in autumn into winter, you knew it was going to be cold. Perpetual wet weather though, did it get you down and did you ever consider just stopping?
My usual tactic when I have to cycle in rain is to put on headphones and some music. Music definitely helps me cope with bad weather, upbeat music. And it also usually makes me laugh, just laughing at the situation, thinking, I chose this, I chose to be here, and it's not the world's best weather. I could be warm and dry inside, working an office job, but I'm not. So you might as well make the most of it. I think on the day that I had snow in the South Island, I definitely had doubts as to whether I should even continue the tour because my sleeping gear, sleeping bag, sleeping pad is not made for winter weather. It's 3-season and I hadn't expected it to be that cold. And I put on all my clothes and was cycling, but my fingers were freezing and I could hardly feel the brakes. And luckily I was headed downhill and I knew that I was going to reach this town. But, I was rethinking my plan and I had cycled for a week at that point once I restarted my tour and was thinking, do I need to ring the previous family I was ringing with to get them to pick me up? Should I just restart the tour from further on? What if the whole valley is covered in snow? It's really easy to have doubts when the weather is bad. So getting in somewhere warm and dry and having a hot drink. And luckily for me, the sun came out and I was headed into a part of New Zealand that in the South Island that hadn't had a huge snowfall then. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll see how the next day goes. And if I make it through that, then maybe I can continue the tour. And I think taking it day by day is really helpful.
Thinking about like the comforts from bicycle touring as well. There's a lot of physical comforts, and you were talking about, you knew you were setting off in grim weather. You had some grim weather. The rain wasn't the worst of it per se, but the cold certainly was. And, there's a lot of comfort that we take from being able to have like a hot drink or something like that. There's also that sort of mental comfort. Like, you were talking about the self-talk of, well, I've chosen to do this, I'm doing this, and I'm not in an office. There would have also been like the uplifting mental boost from just your surroundings in New Zealand. And I wondered, when I was saying about how you planned your trip, when you got to the South Island and you weren't really on the Tour Aotearoa there, were you sort of thinking ahead as well as, I can't wait to see this place or I want to see this area and stuff? Like, did you have milestones from that perspective in your mind as well, rather than just, the final end point? And notwithstanding not planning every single detail, there must have been mini motivations and mini milestones along the way too, right?
Yeah. So when I set off from the very far north, my first motivation was just making it back to Auckland, being able to catch up with friends and take a couple of days off in the city. The couple of days off actually turned into 10, thanks to some bad weather, an atmospheric river that was moving through. That's what the meteorologists called it. So a lot of rain. But that was my first kind of motivational marker, was make it to Auckland. And then I thought, okay, if I can make it to 1,000 kilometers cycled, then I've only got about another 1,000 or so to go to where I need to be by the start of winter. Then it was making it to Wellington, where I had another friend that I was going to stay with. And, that would be the North Island cycled. And then in the South Island, I was looking to make it to Christchurch, because from there it was only about 100 or so kilometers to go. So I think with any cycle tour that I've planned or have started, it seems very intimidating when you think about the whole length of it. You think, how on earth will I ever cycle that? Because it's really quite far. But even in a day, if I have 100 kilometers to cycle and I cycle 10, I think, okay, well, I've done 10%, and then you do 15 and so on. You break it down into chunks. And sometimes, especially with tougher terrain, there was a lot of incline in the North Island. I would think, well, I want to make it to the top of that hill and then I'll take a break. I'll have a snack. I'll have a bigger gulp of water. But if I can make it up there without stopping, or sometimes I had to push my bike, so just push it up there, then it's a little bit further. So I think not thinking too far ahead is also helpful when you're in cycle touring mode. Usually I'm pretty good with planning, my kind of cycling timeframes, both with my European tour and my New Zealand tour. My estimates of when I would get to Wellington and when I would get to, for example, Berlin, ended up being pretty spot on. I'm realistic about how far I know I can cycle and what time I'll probably wake up in the morning.
What time is that, Viivi?
6:30. 6:37, which I know is when some cyclists set off, but I may not leave the campground until 9:30, 10, because I'm quite slow at packing up and like to enjoy my breakfast and take some time to think. But I will then cycle until the light runs out.
Are you a coffee drinker?
I am, yes, coffee.
Oh, I have to ask this question too. Are you a Moomin fan as well?
Yes, I grew up with the Mormon cartoons. I don't have a Moomin mug, but yeah, very famous in Finland. I used to have one, but I sold it when I was coming to New Zealand. They're quite fragile, breakable, and there are many more people who collect them than me. So I just had one.
Okay, I was wondering, do they have like a Moomin mug version that camp friendly?
They may well do. I will admit, I do drink coffee, but I'm not enough of a coffee snub to carry an AeroPress, which is very common in New Zealand. All the outdoor stores sell them because Kiwis, like Australians, are quite fussy about their coffee. I just drink instant coffee sachets and mix them in. If I have milk available, I will happily add it in, but it's kind of cheap and cheerful.
I was more, my motivations with the coffee there, though, was like, I know there's certain guests of mine that nothing happens until they've had a coffee in the morning. Packing up the tent and stuff, like that's part of their ritual is I get up and then I treat myself to a coffee and then everything else will happen. And I was wondering whether you're realistic. Obviously, you're not the earliest of risers. I think 6:30 is pretty early. but you're not leaving in a flash either. You're not packing up camp so quickly. And I was wondering, is that because you're taking the time for those morning rituals and those morning comforts, and maybe coffee's part of that, or tea or something like that as well?
Yep, exactly. So I would wake up in the morning and make my breakfast, and then I would roll up my sleeping bag and sleeping pad and take down the tent, especially if it had rained, if it was an opportunity to dry the tent. And yeah, just take a couple of moments in the morning to think, okay, what's the weather going to be like today? How far do I have to go? And look around the campsite. Sometimes I was getting in, just before dark and had to pitch quite quickly and didn't really have a chance to look around. So I was never really in a rush, but the few times I did encounter other cyclists, they were always off well before me, and kudos to them. It's just not something that I ever felt the need to rush through. And I was having usually porridge for breakfast, so something quite simple.
I was actually thinking there when you were saying about drying out the tent when you could. I need to talk about your weather gear. Like you must have had more than just a raincoat to cycle through that misery. What rain pants did you use? Or did you use rain pants?
I did. I hadn't previously used them. When I had made inquiries of other cyclists planning my European tour as to whether or not they wore any rain pants, because obviously the plastic, crinkling, etc., can be a bit annoying. They said, it's never really that bad, and in their experience, and you can cycle in leggings, and if you get wet, they'll dry out. I knew that in New Zealand it does rain more than most places in Europe, so I bought some outdoor waterproof trousers from Mountain Warehouse, I think it was, and they served me quite well. It was actually my rain jacket that was more of an issue. It was a water resistant jacket, like one from North Face, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily made for like rain. So there were times when it was damp. I found it more effective to cycle with like one of those cheap ponchos that you can get from, the $2 ones. Yeah, if I could keep my inner layers dry, where usually my phone was hidden, then I didn't mind so much if, my sleeves got a little bit damp, etc. It was more, I think, about keeping my core warm. And for sleeping at night, I did have things like a beanie, I had merino layers, I had gloves, I had a fleece. So I had a whole set of pajamas that were very much, oriented towards layering because I knew it would get colder. But during the day, yeah, cycling in sandals and waterproof trousers, if it was raining, was something that I did. But otherwise, I just had kind of your standard workout leggings. It did have one pair of cycling leggings that had the chamois cushioning, and I would alternate those with a pair of kind of cheaper Amazon cycling shorts that I've used for a number of years. I had anti-chafing butter. I was lucky to avoid saddle sores on this tour in New Zealand. I did get one on my cycle tour in Poland and can confirm they are terrible.
That's really fortunate, Viivi, because especially cycling through persistently wet weather, that can be the type of conditions that would really spark on a saddle sore too. So that's pretty cool.
I think my top tip for that, and some people may think this is nuts, but I made sure that I was showering in some format or washing every day. So if I stayed at a campsite that didn't, and most of them don't have showers, the few that do here may have cold showers unless you're staying in a private campsite, in which case they will have warm ones. So I did sometimes stay in a hostel and was able to, wash my hair, do some laundry, and yeah, have a hot shower. But otherwise, I would sacrifice a little bit of camping gas to heat up some water in my camping pan and mix that with cold water, pour it into one of your squirty bottles that you have in your bike cage for drinking your energy drink, and rinse off with that. Even 1 liter, I find, goes quite far. I did, on the South Island portion of my journey, invest in a portable shower system from Sea to Summit. And I started using it when I was camping then the second half of my trip, and made it much more comfortable. I just got a slightly longer shower and had to use less water, wasn't wasting so much. And that cost about, I think, 20 euros. So fairly cheap, but for me, a great investment. I know that some people are less fussy, but yeah, staying clean and dry, like you've mentioned, definitely helps avoid saddle sores, which really can ruin a trip.
when you're talking about heating the water up in just your bike bottle and stuff, that was a hot tip I've come up with now with a couple of cyclists for dealing with really cold overnight temperatures. And it is heating up some water in a bottle, if you've got a hot water bottle, or in a bottle, and wrapping it up with lots of clothes and putting that in the sleeping bag with you, just as that extra little bit of warmth as well.
I definitely tried that. I did Google all the trips for, tips for staying warm in a sleeping bag. Unfortunately, I was even in the North Island around Tongariro, which is a volcanic plateau in kind of the middle of the island. I was experiencing quite cold temperatures. It was the only time, apart from the snow in the South Island, where I woke up with a tent that was actually frozen. It must have dropped to below zero. And yeah, that was quite uncomfortable sleeping. I am investing in the coming months in a sleeping bag designed for colder temperatures, because everything I've tried so far hasn't yet worked. I'm still waking up cold, but sometimes in colder temperatures with the setup that I have, which is 3-season. But yeah, I mean, I guess most people don't anticipate cycling winter, but for anyone that is interested in it, I did read a cycling book from a guy called Geordie Stewart, which is a Rolling Stone, and he left the British Army to cycle 13,000 miles to Singapore from London, and he cycled through Kazakhstan in minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. So I would recommend reading his book for any survival tips. I will personally not be undertaking that journey, but some people may well want to.
Yeah, minus 40, that's pretty extreme. And when you're talking about there, I think you've earned your 4-season sleeping bag when you do get it. You've definitely endured some cold temps. Vivi, a question which I want to ask you now, it's one I've started asking guests relatively recently, and that is, I'd like you to tell me about one day of your tour. You can be any day that you like, and yeah, just tell me about it. Tell me about that experience on that one day.
I think one of the most unique days that if you're cycling the full Tour Aotearoa route is cycling in the very far north, almost at the tip of New Zealand near Cape Renga. So that was my second day of the tour. Actually, no, sorry, the third day. I had cycled up from a town called Kaitaia on the first day, made it up to the Cape on the second day, and was leaving a campsite in what then turned out to be quite torrential rain. So the first bad weather of my trip, and it kind of gave me a taster of what was to come, but also how to deal with it. And I cycled part of the same route that I had come down before on a tarmac road, and then turned off towards a giant sand dune, which is called Tipaki. I stopped off for a toilet break and ended up hiding out in the toilet for an hour, wishing the weather would get better. It didn't, but I have many photos of me in my fluorescent cycling vest and my poncho and standing out with my bike. The toilet was very waterproof. But then I had to set off and decided to leave the car park. And that was very much dictated by the fact that the next bit of my route was affected by the tide. And it's the only section on the route that is. But you need to cycle as part of the route, a section called 90 Mile Beach, which is apparently only about 55 miles long. So it gets its name kind of erroneously.
I wonder if it should be 90-kilometre beach, because that would be nearly right.
You would think so.
Yeah.
So I knew in advance about the tidal issue and had looked at the tide times and knew that if I got onto the beach at about midday, I would have until about 7. So it takes 6 to 7 hours to cycle the beach normally. It depends on how fast you're going and the winds. What I had failed to notice in my research was that to get to the beach from where this sand dune was, you needed to slog and drag your bike through a river because it was pretty unrideable for about an hour. There was soft sand in many places, and it was through a stream. And I was the only person apart from some locals driving in utes through the stream to get onto the sand. And I thought, is this really the route? How did I miss this in my research? How did I not realize I'd be walking in a river from the start? And it was still raining at this point. But the sand dune was beautiful. It was massive. It was on my right. And it was definitely an experience. I had been looking forward to cycling on the beach. Novelty factor very high, something I'd never done. I can confirm the novelty very quickly wore off after about 30 minutes because it was a grey day. There was very little landscape to see. And even if it had been sunny, you unfortunately can't see all the way across to Australia from New Zealand. So it's just a lot of sea. And the beach looks all the same. The sand dunes roll into one. And like I mentioned, it's quite a long way cycling. I didn't make quite the headway that I had wanted to owing to a crosswind, which was actually blowing the sand from the higher point of the beach across onto the lower, but right across my bike. So I was having sand kind of build up on one side of my body, one side of my pedals, would have to stop every once in a while, try and rinse it off with some water from a stream. I'd fill up my bottle on the bike cage and try and rinse down my bike. So I didn't make it all the way down the beach, which some people do on their first day. So I stayed at a campsite a little bit further down, where luckily I was able to get a hot shower, private campsite that was also a stopping point for people who are through hiking New Zealand. It's a separate trail to the cycle trail, and it's called Tour Aotearoa. So there were some hikers coming through and a logbook. So I stayed the night there, and then the next morning continued. But it was an interesting start to my trip. I knew that I would be in for some weather. I just didn't know when it would hit. And I did find out at the end of that day that the sand, which had been blowing all day, had worn through most of my brake pads. And I had seen actually in the cycle preparation guide that they recommended bringing spare brake pads, but they didn't explain why. And I thought, well, I've never needed them before, and I didn't need them on my European tour. So what could I possibly have to do with those? So I didn't buy them. And yeah, until I got back to Auckland, there didn't end up being anywhere for me to be able to buy brake pads on account of there being a public holiday and the bike shop I passed through later on being closed. So I was lucky that I was able to survive with working brakes by just tightening up the kind of brake mechanism on the disc brakes and not replacing the pads. But yeah, they were worn through to the metal just on account of how abrasive the sand was. So my top tip would be, don't ruin your favorite bike by cycling on sand. Get a rental bike and cycle it on sand. Get a fat bike. You'll have much more fun doing it that way. And yeah, try and avoid cycling in a crosswind. At least it wasn't a headwind. I think that's a big reason why people cycle the tour in summer, is that with prevailing winds, you often get a tailwind. And so you can fly down the beach, which was certainly not my experience. So it wasn't my favorite day, but it was memorable, and it was quite near the start. And I think set the tone for what a lot of the North Island would be, which, like I've mentioned before, was a lot of rain. So at least I came to expect it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking when you were saying about the beach after about, was it 30 minutes, it's all about the same. The view looks the same, the beach is the same, the sand's the same, the novelty's worn off. I was thinking, I bet you're somewhat happy though, notwithstanding the fact that the sand ruined your brake pads. I bet you're somewhat happy that it was a sandy beach and not a pebbly beach. Could you imagine riding that far on a pebbly beach?
Absolutely not. You would have to push your bike.
That'd be worse than corrugations, unless you had a fat bike. But oh my goodness, no. Well, what an experience. And like you said, really set the tone there. Because I'm thinking, in clear contrast to that and those sandy beaches and those days, I imagine as you got through the South Island, and you know, I know some of the routes that you took there, like the Alps to Ocean Trail and stuff, you're cycling with some spectacular mountain scenery all around you there as well. Not saying the mountains aren't in the North Island, they are, but in the South Island there, what a place to cycle as well.
Yeah, they're definitely very different. And I think a lot of people who come to New Zealand and may not have time to ride the full tour will often just pick the South Island because, you know, it is known for being super scenic. I do love the native bush of the north. It's super lush, super green, subtropical rainforests. And it is a lot hillier than you might think. There are volcanoes on the way and many other things to pass through. Yeah, I think wherever you cycle in New Zealand will be beautiful. The east coast that I cycled is actually, it's quite dry. It's quite arid. It's in a rain shadow, which is great, you know, in terms of weather, but can also mean that once you get to a certain point, past Christchurch especially, you hit the Canterbury Plains and it's a little bit flat and the winds can be really, really high. So actually both times that I have attempted cycling from Christchurch to Methven, both in the middle of my route and then at the end when I had reached the bottom of New Zealand and flew back to go pick up my car, both times on that route, I failed to make it to Methven by bike. I had to be picked up in a car. The second time I luckily got offered a ride hitchhiking because the winds were so high on my second attempt that I was being blown off of my bike. Just there's very little wind shelter on those plains.
It's a horrible feeling being blown off your bike with strong crosswinds. Like I think headwinds are horrible. They're soul destroying for me and for most people. I don't know many people who enjoy a headwind, but crosswinds, they go from being soul destroying to sort of being dangerous at the right ferocity there as well. Especially on a loaded bike, you've got more surface area for the wind to catch on as well.
Mm.
What was it like reaching the end then, like finishing your journey? finishing a journey that, you had like a mini 4-month hiatus in between while you were doing your work there at the ski resort. But I just think of all the different sort of places you went to, the experiences that you had, the interactions with the people. When you finish a trip like that, what was your feelings? Like, how would you describe your feelings at the finish?
I think because of the time of the year that I did it in, there wasn't any other cyclists around. So at both ends of the tour, they have a pole that's got, markers to however many thousand kilometers away a big city is, however far London, New York are, etc. When I finished at the southern end, I was all alone. It was just before sunset. My last day actually came a day earlier than I'd expected to be finishing because I was cycling down the east coast of New Zealand through a region called the Catlins, and had looked at staying in the nearby bigger town called Invercargill, and then thought, you know what, if I just push on 2 more hours, I could make it down to Bluff, which is the kind of headland that the South Island ends on. And I had plans to go hiking and the weather window looked good. So I wanted to get across on a ferry to Stewart Island, which is often called New Zealand's third island. And there are some hiking tracks and it's famous for kiwi birds that you may or may not run into in the forest. So I decided to go for a push. I think on my last day, I cycled around 120 kilometers. So it was quite anticlimactic, actually. Rolled up to the campsite and paid and checked in. And I think some cyclists, I know that people like to start stories and, start conversations with stories about their cycles. But I think I was quite low key on my trip. If people asked where I was going, I would tell them. And I think it was much more common maybe in Europe on my tour to be asked. And I would often reply with Berlin, because actually when I set off on that tour, I wasn't sure if I could definitely make it to Poland. I hadn't bought a return ticket. I said, I'll see if I make it to Berlin. And if I do, then I'll decide whether I'm flying back from there or from Poland. But actually, in the case of my New Zealand tour, I had booked a flight probably with about a month's notice. And so I had a set deadline to be back. I could do whatever I wanted in between, but I needed to make that flight. So yeah, I was super happy to make it to the end, but it was maybe a little bit different doing it in kind of 2 halves or splitting it up midway. A lot of people that do the route, like I mentioned before, aim to finish it kind of in 30 days or less. I cycled for about 6 weeks in total, notwithstanding breaks, but I did feel like it was kind of not the end of an adventure, but it was very much the culmination of having set off all those months ago back in April from the North Island and then making it down to the bottom of the South Island in early November was something that it kind of spanned more than 6 months. But in that sense, yes, it wasn't an around the world tour, but it was a through New Zealand tour. And the landscape changed so much. And I met so many different people, and the weather as well changed a lot in the seasons that I was able to experience. I think it was rewarding in that sense, rather than trying to rush the tour and seeing it at one specific time of year, which for a lot of people is summer. I can recommend for that reason, maybe planning it, over a longer period of time or breaking it up into stretches. And that's actually how a lot of people complete the hiking trail, the Tour Aotearoa. Lots of people for the hiking trail break it up into 1 week or 2 week sections and will come back for the months and years and hike sections as and when they want. And I think that could be a really good way to approach bike travel as well, is that every tour doesn't have to be this massively long or, one singular event, that you could return to the same places and you maybe pick up from where you left off. And that is something I have in the back of my mind for if I do go back to Europe, it would be nice to go back to Posnan and pick up the tour from there and see where I get to, whether it's turning south, although I'm not that keen to cross the Alps. I don't love cycling across mountains on my bike. Maybe not a little bit less like you in the Pyrenees, but I could also continue east.
There's some nice roads there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the idea of continuing a route that you were on previously and seeing where it goes definitely does appeal to me. So watch the space. You don't know where I might end up in the future. Neither do I at this moment in time.
The question I have for you is, what are your views of yourself undertaking trips like this? You were talking earlier about taking inspiration from female authors who'd undertaken trips on their own. You've taken a journey on your own here as a solo female as well. What's your view of yourself? How do you think about yourself now having done these things?
I think I definitely feel a lot more competent Even with my European tour, there were quite a few differences between that one and my New Zealand tour. I had more mechanical issues in Europe. I ended up having to get a tire changed out. It was worn through, but there was always a bike shop around to help. Whereas in New Zealand, the punctures that I did get, I think I luckily only had about 5. At no point did I have anybody offering to help me with them. And yeah, having to be self-reliant in terms of supplies, knowing the areas I was entering, how long I'd have to go until the next shop, etc., making sure I had enough water. Something that I have used in New Zealand but had never used before in Europe is filtration tablets for water, relying on yourself having enough knowledge and safety and experience to get through the tour. It's something that I definitely feel like I've gained on all of my tours, but also just I think that confidence thing in yourself and having less doubt. I know how far I can cycle in a day. I know what routes I'm capable of. But even on my tours, whether it's in New Zealand or Europe, I've often heard from that they wouldn't recommend a particular route. They don't think that I'll be able to make it. Nobody cycles that way. It's way too hard. They tried it when they were younger and they didn't make it up. And all those things can be really off-putting. And the times that they've been said to me are the only times I've started to really doubt and think, well, can I do this? Because my approach often day to day is not necessarily to research the elevation profile in detail. It's to just go meet the challenge as it comes and think, oh, this is a little bit harder than I thought it was going to be, but it probably ends soon. And then maybe at the end of the day, you look at your stats and go, oh, wow, that was actually quite a lot of elevation. And maybe I didn't, if I'd known it was ahead of me, maybe I would have been more doubtful. So I think with those experiences of along the way of having people doubt whether or not you can do it, in many ways, it strengthens your resolve when you think, well, actually, you've never been cycling on my bike. You're not me. You don't know what these legs are capable of. But yeah, it's more of a quiet confidence, I guess, and knowing that you were able to do it. And I think it has been nice in that I've had some friends reach out to me where they've been planning maybe shorter tours of their own and say, oh, I saw you went here on a bike and I was thinking of maybe buying one. And my advice to people is always to just go for it. When I started cycling, I did not have a fancy bike. I had absolutely zero idea how to fix a puncture. I had to go to a bike shop every time. You don't need fancy gear. And I think a lot of that expectation of, what you should and shouldn't have as somebody going into cycle touring can be quite off-putting and quite daunting. But really anybody can cycle from one village to another or one town to another. And if you don't make it all the way, there's usually somebody you can call or someone who's willing to give you a ride for the goodness of their heart and take you the rest of the way or take you back to where you came from. So yeah, my advice is to just go for it. And I think that's what's been nice coming out of these tours is knowing that I can give that quiet encouragement to friends or people that I meet as a story and say, oh, I really am not anything that special. I just thought, well, maybe I should give it a go. And the worst that happens is maybe I need to catch a flight back or catch a bus.
I think now what's happened, Viivi, is you have become another example of someone showing the way. You've sparked off the curiosity in your friends and you have taken on things. You've proven to yourself what you can do. And I really love that there's people now seeing that as an example to challenge themselves to do the same. I love hearing those sort of stories. So I'm thankful for you doing it and for setting those examples too. I hope to see more of us women out there taking on these type of adventures because they are really, really enriching. I've got 3 quick questions to ask you to finish off the show. The first one is music related. You did mention during our chat earlier that you did use music as a motivator for you to help lift your mood on those downbeat rainy days. If you had to pick a song then to be the soundtrack of your tour, what would that song be?
Did have a playlist on Spotify, and one of my new discoveries was a song. The title is Bigger Than. I think it's by Jesse Soothe, but I will send you the spelling so that it's 100% right. But one of the lyrics is, I want a life that's bigger than all of the fears that I have, which I think is quite apt for a lot of people that go cycle touring, that go adventuring. They, everybody has doubts. It's normal to wonder if you'll make it to the end of whatever your plans are, but it's quite a nice sentiment to go forward with. So when that came on and I was cycling up a particularly big hill, I would think, well, this is great. This is giving me some motivation and I definitely now need to make it to the top.
Oh, I love it. So your song is going to be added to the Seek Travel Ride playlist. And if you're looking for new playlists, then Vivi, check us out there, Seek Travel Ride on Spotify. You can bop along to the tunes that helped a lot of my guests through their own adventures. A very eclectic mix. I love it because every time I listen to it, I remember each of my guests' adventures and stories, and it sort of transports me there as well. No one song is like the other. Okay, final two questions. As a listener of the show, you'll know what these are. Maybe you've given them a lot of thought. Maybe your views on what you would pick have changed as part of your experiences. First one, you're given the challenge one day that you're going to be cycling either all day into a constant hill climb, up a hill, or into a constant headwind. Which one are you going to pick?
Until my tour through New Zealand, I would have said the headwind. I didn't think wind could be that bad. But as I recounted to you the story of crosswinds, both on 90 Mile Beach as well as then on the South Island and the Canterbury Plains, I now have a well-founded fear of wind. So I will join the masses in cycling up the never-ending hill, which at some point, at least you'll get some views and you'll get to whiz down the other side, which I think is the big temptation for everyone in picking that option.
Yeah, it's always about the views. Some people it's for the descents as well, but yeah, the views always come up quite a lot. And I imagine that you had many, many moments of being able to savor those views as you made your way slowly but surely up every sort of climb as well. Okay, final question, Vivi. You're going to be riding your bike for 4 hours and you have the choice to do 4 hours of cycling on your own or 4 hours of cycling with other people. Which one would you choose?
I think my views on this question haven't changed so much. I would pick cycling alone. Some of my not so great cycling experiences with others have been with actually cyclists that are not drivers, car drivers themselves. They maybe don't anticipate kind of signaling and things the same way, especially if you're riding in kind of single file. I find it a little bit stressful. Yeah, I find it hard to be evenly matched. I've yet to find a cycling buddy who I think, we gel really, really well together. I'd love to spend 4 hours with you cycling. So yeah, I think maybe spending 4 hours thinking thoughts through in my head and sorting through problems in my life, which I think some other cyclists have mentioned before as well. That could be a good use of my time rather than stressing about how well I'm coping with someone else's demands. But I would love to get into group cycling in the future. Could definitely be more social and spread the joy and the misery of bad weather a bit further.
You're right. We often recount the stories of the most miserable weather experiences that we've had to endure on those trips. So there is that bonding over that type of thing that emboldens our resolve together, doesn't it? And that solidarity of getting through something. Lastly, if people want to follow along with your adventures, how can they do that? What social media could they follow you on?
So I am on Instagram. I have posted some of my cycles throughout the world and kind of highlights and, linked information on routes and wherever I can. My handle, I will send it to you as well, just for spelling, but it's at the.yemina, JEMINA.world. And I do post quite regularly with my travels across New Zealand and currently my pet sitting adventures, which I also managed to do some of on my cycle route, and highly recommend clicking on those posts. And if you're interested in finding a different form of accommodation to just hostels and campsites and things and breaking up your cycle in a different way,
Yeah.
it's something that I am looking forward to doing more of in this new year, even without cycling on the current agenda now that I'm back to living in a city.
Awesome. I will definitely put a link to that in our show notes as well. Well, Viivi Rissanen, it has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you, to learn more about your travels. And you've definitely filled my own personal cup of wanderlust up much more. Maybe not for cycling through grim, wet, and then cold weather, but for certainly just taking the approach of it doesn't matter how far we go today, just enjoy the ride, enjoy the journey, and enjoy the experience of finding out more about your surroundings and about the people that you may meet and the unexpected good things that can come on your way as well. Thank you so, so much for sharing your stories and experiences here for Seek Travel Ride.
Thanks for having me, and happy cycling.
That was such a great chat I had with Viivi. I loved learning everything about her recent tour, but also just more about her and how travel has been a way of life from her, almost really since she was raised, living in 10 countries, being multilingual, And I especially love the approach that she takes to her bicycle adventures. It's not about going fast, it's not about fancy gear or anything like that. It's about being comfortable and experiencing a place in that method of true slow travel, which a bicycle can give you. Thanks, Viivi, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what adventures are around the corner for you. Now, if you've been enjoying listening to the show and you want to learn more about the guests and get into the details and join the Seek Travel Ride community, then definitely head over to Facebook and join the Seek Travel Ride group. You'll find links to that in the show notes. There's a lot of us there. It's growing week on week, and you'll be able to get a little bit more detail about each one of our guests. Some of them are even in the group themselves. Make sure you're following the show on your podcast player so that you get notified of every new episode when it drops. We release new episodes every week, and I've got lots of exciting guests up ahead in the schedule for you to listen to. I'm really excited about the stories to come. And then until the next episode, I'm your host, Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.